There's a fundamental issue that anybody who's like working in forest policy then at some point bang their heads against, which is the definition of what is a forest? What do you call a forest? Right? Often definition of forest is something like 15% forest cover and trees at least 5 meters tall, which, I look out of the window here in Florence, there's a parking lot that meets that definition of forest. It has 15% forest cover and trees that are more than 5 meters tall. And when you actually apply these definitions in operating landscapes where you have carbon projects, often it's very messy because you're operating at the edge of that definition. So if you have a project, let's say in the Cerrado, where you have a savanna, or in a lot of the dry forest in East Africa, you're operating at that edge of the definition where you're one side, you have 1 tree more, you're inside, you have 1 tree less, you're outside, and so on. Measuring carbon cuts through all that stuff and basically say, this is how many tons of carbon there are. Is there more carbon now than there were before? Yes, great. That's what we wanted. Is there less carbon? That's not what we wanted. That's what we're trying to avoid. And so it plugs directly in what these policies and intervention from a climate point of view are trying to do, which is get carbon out of the atmosphere or prevent carbon from going into the atmosphere from the biogenic pools.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to This Week in Carbon. I'm your host, Eddie Smith, joined, as always, by my co-host, Rene Velasquez. And today, we're excited to be joined by Marco Albani, co-founder and CEO of Chloris Geospatial. Marco has spent his career at the intersection of forestry, climate science, and environmental markets. Marco, it's great to have you with us today, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Great to be here, Eddie.
Yeah, so I think to get started, maybe as an intro to you and our audience, it'd be great to learn about, the origin story behind Chloris, right? I think I've heard that it was 2 forestry students in Florence in the 90s who ended up building a space tech company. So I think it'd be great
a long
if
time
you could tell
after.
us.
Yeah, so Alessandro Baccini was my co-founder and the chief scientist of Chloris and the mind behind the technology that makes these maps. And I met in forestry school in Florence in the mid-90s. Ale was this kind of white skinny guy that biked everywhere and tracked wolves in the mountains of the Apennines. And we basically got to know each other and we went off our own ways. And then in the early 2000s, we met again in Boston. Ale was doing his PhD at Boston University and started to build a technology that eventually underpinned Chloris. And I was doing a postdoc on the other side of the river, working on basically continental scale carbon modeling, long-term carbon dynamics. And it was starting this, back then, the whole big question in the science side was like, what was called the missing sink. So the fact that when you're inverting carbon data, so how much carbon is in the atmosphere, how much carbon we're emitting, there was actually less carbon than you expected. And the theory was that it was being sequestered by forests, because that's the only place where we actually did not have a good measurement of how much was there. And so I was working with a guy that was basically trying to build models that simulated forest at large continental scales to see how much carbon was actually drawn down into forest and how long would it stay there and how long would it continue to sink. And then we went again our separate ways. Ale stuck with the science and I went off to the dark side. I joined McKinsey company. I was part of their sustainability team. I actually built the forestry portion of the McKinsey Marginal Abatement cost curve, which was my next kind of foray into forest and carbon policy and carbon markets. And also had the first experience of actually having like an environmentalist campaign against me, which was an interesting experience because Greenpeace actually did the campaign against the McKinsey Marginal Abatement cost curves with kind of like greedy management consultants with hooked noses and like bags full of cash running around the world and trying to peddle their wares. And then I did that.
The marginal abatement cost curve? That's crazy.
Yeah. You look it up, go online. So then I basically I spent 10 years there working on a whole bunch of like forest and carbon issues. And And from there, I went to run the Tropical Forest Alliance, which is a platform for zero deforestation supply chains. So again, forest deforestation, carbon, but in this case, tied to supply chains. How do we get deforestation out of supply chains? And in the meanwhile, Ale was building the science. So he was the first to actually start to use spaceborne LIDAR to train machine learning models to monitor carbon storage at scale, which is the technology that underpin what we do and what a bunch of other DMRB companies do today. Except at the time, there was no JEDI. So this was done for the first time using an instrument called IceSat, which was put in space to measure the thickness of ice. But then they figure out, well, actually, it also measured the thickness of forest. And so Ale went off around the world training the allometric equations to actually take the IceSat measurement and turn that into a forest carbon measurement and develop the first map. And so his paper, I think, one of made the front cover of Science in the 2012s or 17, I forget exactly. And so that was a technology. And then in the late teens, early 20s, we start to talk about really this gap in knowledge around forest carbon is really something that is impeding policy. At the time, we were much more interested in things like JRED and that kind of stuff. And so in COVID came around, we all had career changes around COVID, and we figured, why don't we actually take this technology and try to use it to drive action? So that was really the fundamental idea of Chloris. And we brought together two other guys. It's an old man lineup. Mark Friedel, who still is professor of remote sensing at Boston University, and he had been founder of another space tech company, so he had that kind of experience. And Giulio Boccaletti, who was at McKinsey with me back then, and then he had gone off to be the chief strategy officer of the Nature Conservancy, and then a acclaimed author on all things water. And so Giulio and Mark helped us set it up and remain as advisors to Chloris. And Al and I basically quit our day jobs and fundamentally started to do this thing full time, raised the first institutional money in 21. And we've been at it for about 5 years now, I would say, full time.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating story, a great story. But I think I want to zoom out for a second, right? I think, you mentioned how you spent decades studying forests and working in policy in the private sector. When you founded Chloris, what was the problem or challenge that you saw that wasn't being solved in the space, right? And why is measuring carbon in forests so hard in the first place?
Yeah. So the thing that was kind of hitting us was one is that the information existed in the academic space but wasn't being used. So there was initial translation. And I have been, as TFA, I had been exposed a lot to the birth, the launch, and the rollout of Global Forest Watch. And I remember being in Davos with Matt Hansen and Andrew Steer, who at the time was the CEO of GFW, of WRI, in which the GFW was being organized. It was just, and they had a giant screen, and they were showing GFW, did all these great maps, and they had all these CEOs at that time, Paul Pullman at Unilever, DMAC at Cargill, in these meetings, talking about how this was this transformational thing. And I think it has been, right? And it seriously has been a massive contribution to this, but it didn't seem to actually land in the action. When I was talking to procurement managers, to people who were running action, and I wasn't involved with carbon projects at the time. It was all on zero deforestation, no peat, no deforestation, no exploitation commitments, and all that kind of stuff. They seemed to go and use something else, right? So they were basically, Starling was set up, for example, by Airbus with the Earthworm Foundation. And then you had Satelligence coming out with their solution, which was very much like kind of a private sector Global Forest Watch, if you want. And so one thing was hitting us is why do we need a private sector version of this if there's a public one, right? And then you talk to people and you find out why is just generally a donor-funded global map doesn't necessarily meet the needs of somebody who wants to know something about some very specific place, which is different, right? So the fact that you've made a great map of the Amazon doesn't necessarily help the person who actually is only interested in that specific piece of it. as a private sector entity, you have an incentive to actually respond to that need. If you're donor driven, you don't necessarily have the incentive or the way to be rewarded for doing that work. And the other thing is this carbon versus land cover and deforestation. And this is like more Alessandro's kind of very, very strong point of view, which is like, who cares about forest cover? We care about how much carbon is there. Now, of course, for all sorts of things, we also care about forest cover. But I'll spend a bunch of time at FAO working on forest resource assessment. I have spent more time than I will ever get back in meetings with FAO, UNDP, other of this organization, debating the definition of forest. There's a fundamental issue that anybody who's like working in forest policy then at some point bang their heads against, which is the definition of what is a forest? What do you call a forest? Right? Often definition of forest is something like 15% forest cover and trees at least 5 meters tall, which, I look out of the window here in Florence, there's a parking lot that meets that definition of forest. It has 15% forest cover and trees that are more than 5 meters tall. So the definition, and when you actually apply these definitions in operating landscapes where you have carbon projects, often it's very messy because you're operating at the edge of that definition. So if you have a project, let's say in the Cerrado, where you have a savanna, or in a lot of the dry forest in East Africa, you're operating at that edge of the definition where you're one side, you have 1 tree more, you're inside, you have 1 tree less, you're outside, and so on. Measuring carbon cuts through all that stuff and basically say, this is how many tons of carbon there are. Is there more carbon now than there were before? Yes, great. That's what we wanted. Is there less carbon? That's not what we wanted. That's what we were trying to avoid. And so it plugs directly in what these policies and intervention from a climate point of view are trying to do, which is get carbon out of the atmosphere or prevent carbon from going into the atmosphere from the biogenic pools. So that was the second need. So one need was like, how do we get something that actually serves the people who are trying to make interventions and is not just kind of high level policy indicator? And we felt that a private company was a much better vehicle for that. And the second one, we think that measuring carbon directly is a much better approach to it than using land use, land cover, which really is land cover. Like if you look at the official definition of, often we talk about land use change, but what you can measure from satellite is not land use, is land cover. So what is there, not how it's being used. And there's a bunch of stuff that falls outside that ability of detection of land cover, like let's say degradation of forest. When you remove a bunch of trees, but there's still enough trees to call it a forest, carbon can drop substantially. When you're based in Singapore, right, in Southeast Asia, there's a lot of logging that has happened over the years that has been selective logging, where basically big trees have been removed. Lots of losses of carbon that are not a change in land cover. So you still have a forest there. There's still trees. It's just that before you had, 700 tons of biomass per hectare, and now you have 350.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, right? So it's actually what you're measuring is the carbon that's actually stored in the vegetation, not just that land cover. And
exactly.
Now with the current satellite and with the data sets, because obviously you're interpreting the data, right? And you're actually crunching the numbers, et cetera. And it's how often and how far back does this kind of understanding go?
We actually spent a lot of time to build a time series of carbon that goes back to the year 2000. This is ours for a while was the longest time series in the industry. I think others have now maybe caught up with us, but I'm not 100% sure. And this was a lot of work to harmonize multiple Landsat missions so that you could actually reconstruct, and also finding, and this was what came from the work that Alessandro had done over the years, the training data that also span multiple time periods. So you actually had training data, not just the recent training data from the JEDI mission, but the older time training data from ISAT. That allows to build a long time series. We have a product at 10 meters that only goes back to 2017 because the last generation, the Sentinel-1 and 2 satellites really are more recent. And so you don't have the time series of the imagery to go further back. This is one of the big limitations of the new sensors. So you have new sensors coming online and they're very interesting and have a lot of potential, but a lot of your interventions, you're trying to actually create counterfactuals and map trends that go back at least 10 years, if not more. And the old sensors, the new sensor cannot do that. I mean, you need to put them on the DeLorean and send them back in time, and now you can get it, but that technology is not available. So now there you are. Like basically, you have great information about the present.
So the historical resolution is like at 30 meters, basically, and the new ones are 10 and below.
Yeah,
so
on
it's
the
very difficult to go back.
public data. Yeah, there are satellites with higher resolution, commercial satellites, but then you hit the cost problem. So all our infrastructure is built on space agency data that is available for free, and that allows us to do this at a cost that is basically the cost of compute and the paying back the people who work on it to make sure that they get decent salary. But we don't actually have to pay for the imagery. There are missions, satellites that produce commercial data that is higher resolution, or even in the past there have been, but they're commercial and they're quite expensive. And then you have, frankly, issues of availability. They generally are not wall to wall. The sensors are generally not the same quality of the space agency sensors, which tend to be better because there's a series of different factors that basically I don't want to say that the sensors of like Airbus are bad. I mean, it's just that these big data sets with the public space agency data have been worked on by a lot of people. There's a lot of understanding what the issues are. It's a much better known product, and it's easier to do something that is cost effective for the carbon industry. Because today, that's the other difference, right? You cannot pay hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars for DMRV. No carbon project can afford that. That's if you have a RED Plus project with 2 million hectares of areas that it needs to monitor between the project, the buffer zones, and so on, if you start to buy commercial imagery for that, you're going to start to rack up some pretty hefty bills, even before any analytics is done on top.
Yeah, and more importantly, before you start actually generating any revenues, and that's just not the business model. Yeah,
no, and even the revenue won't match that. Like at some point, I had a quote from a satellite company for a private commercial satellite company wanted $70 million to analyze to give us the data to analyze a project that probably only generated $3 million worth of credit in its lifetime. It's just like not, so we can give you a discount. It's like, how many nines after 99% can you put? Because that's what.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think, obviously, the space tech landscape has evolved rapidly over the last decade, and especially with the advancement of AI and machine learning in the last few years. But I did want to ask about the limits, right? And kind of this sort of direct measurement from space can sound, to people, can be in some way overselling to some people. And I think, you're still inferring that biomass through models calibrated to field and LIDAR data with real uncertainty, right? So what are the limits today? And do you see these limits being mitigated in the near future? Like how fast are this technology
how fast can it improve? So it's absolutely true. And the first thing is that one should say that the carbon industry sometimes separates remote sensing from direct measurement of biomass. That's actually incorrect. There is no direct measurement of biomass. No one directly measures biomass. People who go in the field, they measure the diameter of trees. They're not measuring biomass. They're measuring the diameter of a tree. Then they plug that number,
the equations, right,
into an allometric equation. Biomass is a mass. So the way you measure it is by weight. So the way you know the biomass of a tree, you cut it down, you oven dry it, and you put it on a scale and weigh it. That's the only direct measurement. So no one does it. So that's the first thing that is very important. There's interesting technology to improve. And the biggest source of uncertainty in everything are these allometric equations. For a lot of species, they don't exist, or they are built on a pretty small sample set. And so they have huge uncertainty, especially where it matters the most, which is the biggest trees. Because generally the relationship between the diameter and sometimes diameter and height, if you have allometric equations that take both, and the biomass tends to be an exponential one. So, when you double the diameter, the biomass spikes up. So the big trees tend to hold most of the biomass in a site, and on those you tend to have the most uncertainty. So that's the first source. That uncertainty then propagates into, let's say, the training data that is used to build models like cars, which are generally a combination of spaceborne and airborne LIDAR. So what you have here, you have a LIDAR instrument, it shoots a laser either from an aerial platform or from a satellite, counts the photons or measures the photons that come back, and basically get a vertical structure of the forest. And from that vertical structure infers a biomass. Now, that inference is based on estimation of what the biomass is, generally also done from this allometric equations. Very interesting technology right now are ground LIDAR systems that allow you to actually do 3D reconstruction of entire canopies. And there's been some interesting results showing that actually you get substantially different results when you do that from when you actually use just diameters and allometric equation. But let's set that aside. Then basically what we do is we take these measurements and we build machine learning models that basically reconstruct the same metric for places that have not been imaged by LIDAR, right? So you basically take the reflectance and a bunch of other information. And then, so you're taking what is basically our measurements point in space, point in time. So you have your JEDI instrument on the International Space Station is running around the Earth when it's turned on, and it's taking LIDAR shots, like every 6 kilometers, I think. And then, the next pass is going to be some. So you have sampling instruments. That is great if you want to know what is the average biomass in Africa or something like that, or in a large area. But if you want to have a specific parcel, you need to actually image that parcel. And so that's what we do, is that we basically reconstruct that biomass from other sensors who are instead wall-to-wall sensors, meaning that they image everything and repeat that imagery every, let's say, 8 days or 7 days or whatever it is, depending on the sensor. So now you have continuous map. What you lose, yes, you lose some accuracy at the individual pixel level. So each individual measurement is less accurate because it's coming out through a series of models, each one of them carrying uncertainty. But what you have now is that you have actually measured everything. So yet, the important thing to remember is that when people do things the old way, which is the way that, carbon standards sometimes see as more accurate, they're not measuring everything. So you are in a 400,000 hectare area that you're doing a RED Plus project in, and you do 20 samples. And so you really have measured on the ground 20 areas of maybe 40 square meters each or 100 square meters or whatever it is, right? But you've measured a fraction. And then you're inferring the dynamics of the entire area using inference statistics. So what a remote sensing product does is that, yes, the measurement at each individual level might be less precise, and there's question whether it is. But anyways, let's give it that it is, then the measurement, the field. But you actually now have measured everything, as opposed to actually now I have a bunch of measurements and I have to use basically sampling theory to reconstruct the full amount. Now, there are limitations, of course, and there are places in which like there's persistent cloud cover, or the allometric equations don't work very well, or the models don't work very well. And you can find that out and then you can fix that. But that's the fundamental kind of gain that you get by using this kind of methodologies, that you have continuous coverage of the entire area. So you see everything, and you have it every year. While often you do not have sampling collected in the field every year. So that is a substantial advantage. So there is like precision or accuracy at the level of each individual measurement, yes, but then there's also how many measurements are you actually taking and how often. And with remote sensing, you go massively up. And it allows you to do all these new things that you couldn't do before, like dynamic baselines, right? Those are and synthetic controls, and all the stuff that got the forest carbon world in trouble when people started to use them to check whether the baselines of the projects were actually correct for red explosion. Those are actually feasible, possible only because you actually have these massive data sets.
Yeah, so it's driven in large part by the science, improving the data, improving the technology, improving ultimately to give us that paradigm shift. But so, Marco, I mean, we could talk about that, but I think our audience might find it super too nerdy if we keep going there. Can I bring it back to just understanding more of the markets piece, especially in terms of like, first part is understanding the types of clients that then Chloris Geospatial has, and then bringing it back to the kind of the lens in the carbon world. So maybe you can give me the overview around who is sourcing this data set and insights derived from it.
Yeah, so we fundamentally have three types of customers today. One is carbon market infrastructure customers. So we work, for example, with Equitable Earth. We provide them the data that powers their models. We work with MSCI. We work with BitZero. So this is like folks that want to know something about most of the market, very large areas. We worked with Vera in the past. Basically, large scale understanding of what is going on. The second one is project developers / investors that care about a set of specific projects. Because the data is scalable, it then can give you information about an individual project. Today, we do a lot of VM47. We're on the data service provider approved for VM47, so stocking index for VM47 projects. And then the third group is corporations that want to understand the greenhouse gas emission of their supply chains. So these are scope 3 emission, what like nerdy DLUC kind of term. If you are a bit into that world of like GHG accounting, it's the same thing, but instead of going into a carbon market project, it goes into a greenhouse gas accounting supply chain workflow. Yes.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. I mean, but they're all leveraging the same level of analysis.
The fundamental data set is the same, which is the data sets that we produce, which are fundamentally 30 and 10 meter resolution, biomass stock and change over time, and then analytical layers on top of it. So we have just released, for example, a carbon risk product where we basically estimate monthly the risk of emissions from deforestation alerts. We released recently a viewer for our data so that you can go online on our website and you can open a viewer and you can look at our data at the full resolution everywhere we have pre-processed for free, by the way. So I encourage anyone who's interested in to try it out because you can actually go and zoom in, and this is the same data that we give to our customers.
Yeah. And I think like segment 3, the geo AI wave is really quite interesting.
Probably the most interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's obviously a technological revolution happening in geo AI, right? Like foundation models such as Google's Alpha Earth that turn satellite data into reusable embeddings and make land cover maps really easy to produce. And as someone whose whole company is geospatial AI, like what are the pros and cons of this, right? Like, is there risks to basically free embeddings or like a flood of cheap maps that look authoritative coming to market? Like, how does that impact the market?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be interesting to see. Obviously, this is playing out live, right? There's a lot of these maps have been released in the wild recently. You have a variety of this embedding model, foundation models. Some of them are releasing the map. Some of them are just releasing the model. And then you have to produce the map yourself. You know, Alpha Earth, Tessera, Clay, and so on. It's very exciting. I mean, the promise of this is the searchable Earth, right? The fact that if you want to ask a Google Maps today, find a pool or find a piece of grass, it cannot do that, right? And so the idea of the embeddings, the foundation models, is that you create things that can be used to basically say, find this, find that, tell me how many roofs of this color are in the city and so on, which have been specialized workflows inside geospatial companies for a while. There is a risk to that. It's like, because it's one thing is that this is like a workflow that is fundamentally to help you take informed decisions on something versus when it actually becomes like a metric in, let's say, a carbon project or in carbon accounting. So there you need to also know the accuracy of the results. And that is not something that it's very easy to produce. So it's easy to make the maps when you have the embeddings. It's not easy to actually know how accurate they are. And so and they tend to be inaccurate in the places where actually some of the thorniest questions are. So I was just looking at the results of the latest round of crop masks maps that have been produced, open data for using the Alpha Earth embeddings. And there's still this very, very difficult ability. The map is basically said, we're 90-something% accurate in determining forests versus non-forest. That's great. But then when you actually look at how accurate it is to tell apart a forest from a cocoa plantation, it's actually not that accurate. And if you have to make decision under UDR to whether include or exclude a producer based on when the cocoa plantation became a cocoa plantation and it was a forest before, that is obviously a very critical decision. And so there you want to be more accurate than that. And the same is going to be if we use them for, let's say, detecting deforestation and setting baselines, jurisdictional baselines for carbon projects and so on, risk map and so on. So what I think there is going to be the need to have a way to actually assess accuracy of this product, whoever makes them, and use them in systems that reward environmental outcomes that you're measuring with this map, so carbon storage, forest conservation, and so on, then that you need to actually meet some accuracy standard. Today is very hard to do that because we don't actually have reliable test beds for this kind of products, which is a challenging kind of issue that we run into it all the time, both with forest cover, where fundamentally you have to build your own kind of accuracy assessment generally. And then you run into the issue when forest definition is challenging is that the benchmark is a human looking at the image and saying it's a forest, it's not a forest. And often the human is not sure either. So that is actually kind of an interesting challenge because you get to these places where you have like three interpreters all looking at it and coming back with a different answer. And then for carbon, you could have actual benchmark because measuring carbon on the ground is actually a lot less controversial than deciding whether something is a forest or not, because it's a number. You get to, but we don't have a lot of accurate test beds that you can use to basically say, okay, how good is this product? How good is the carbon map made by Chloris versus one made by someone else, right? Or versus like in general. And we published a validation exercise where we used a bunch of airborne LIDAR data sets that we have not used to train the model. It's independent data sets to assess the accuracy of the product. And it's actually reasonably good. But the thing that comes out is that when you're trying to assess it against traditional field data, you have a lot more problems because you have issues of geographical location accuracy of the field data. And then just the fact that field data doesn't have the extent, meaning the areas that is measured is generally not big enough to do a meaningful comparison. Most of the field plots are small. And again, we're back in nerdy space, but fundamentally is not a good local estimator of biomass density.
Yeah. And you mentioned how we don't have these test beds today, right? So then the question is who's responsible for building these test beds, right? And validating them. Is it
I mean,
public sector, the governments, the private sector, university, academic studies?
To me, this is a great place in where to put philanthropic and public funds, in the sense that you then enable the confident assessment of what the private sector can produce. Private sector can do it, but then they'll use it for their own private product. Public sector potentially does a good job of it. I mean, the US, the Forest Inventory Assessment of the United States, is a very good data set. And you can actually use it to test the performance of your models in the US. You just don't know how well they work outside. And then you have campaigns. And so there are academic collaborations. This is a great area in which I think philanthropic money that is trying to help accelerate, let's say, the transition to better natural capital assessment could go, like building this kind of test beds. They're expensive to build and they take effort and resources because they need to be big enough and there has to be enough of them, right? You can build one, but then it's like, okay, then you're great measuring that one place, right? What happens when you're somewhere else? And so you need multiple ones. You cannot just have a single test bed. And then you need to they need to be big enough that you're actually determining the behavior and the performance of your model at different scales. So that's a great area for that kind of effort to go into. If I were still in academia, that's what I'd try to set up. And if I had like a lot of money, that's probably what I would do my philanthropy. Pay academics to do that. And then have a governance system to use them. Because obviously if you want to use them as test beds, you have to make sure that then people are not kind of training their model to the test so that it works great in the test, but it doesn't work somewhere else. So there's a bit of governance and management layer that you have to make sure that the tests work as tests.
Yeah, you think, we've spent, some time talking about measurement and validation and trust, but ultimately the reason that it all matters is because we're trying to move a lot of capital into, protecting, preserving, and restoring forests, right? So, and zooming out, like how does better measurement translate into more capital actually flowing into nature, right? And I think a big part of that is the voluntary carbon markets, right? And as well as compliance. But I think, kind of leading into our next segment on Article 6, one theme that's come up is like repeatedly the idea of having a common ruler, not just for one project, but across entire landscapes, jurisdictions, and eventually countries, right? And so why is that consistency so important as we move into the Article 6 era of international carbon markets?
Yeah, I mean, the way I see it, there's a couple of things, right? One, you need better measurement, because if you're fundamentally trying to make the capital flow tied to outcomes, you want to know that these outcomes are credible, right? And they are credible in two ways. One is that the number of tons that you actually have either avoided emission or sequestered is known with reasonable level of accuracy. And the other one is that the counterfactual, so the additionality, to use the term of art, is actually strong enough. And for all of that, these are areas in which like these kind of products that can create data at very large scale, very helpful, because you can create synthetic controls and these fancy things to actually measure additionality, and at the same time improve the accuracy of the measurement. So that's one thing, right? Okay, are we actually getting what we're paying for? And then the other thing is like, how do you actually nest together interventions at various scales? So here you have, against this wicked problem of deforestation and costly endeavor of restoration, you have initiatives and policies that can operate at various levels. So you have national level, you have international level, national level public policy, subnational level public policy, and then you have projects, and you have supply chain interventions. And all of these things are happening at different scales in different places. They're all place-based at some point. The rubber hits the road somewhere. But how do you kind of put that stuff together and in a common kind of framework, and how can you distribute incentives by accounting for what has actually done, what has this project done that is inaccessible, what's going to happen just because of the policy? And so how do I actually split the reward between the policymaker that has set the policy and the project developer that has developed the project on top of it? All those problems that come from nesting interventions, I think, require a common understanding of what is going on that is anchored in consistent measurements that scale from the largest area to the smallest area and add up.
Yeah, I mean, it's super interesting time to be talking about these topics. But I think some people kind of underestimate and are pessimistic about Article 6, and there's other people that are overly optimistic when it comes to Article 6. But
Well,
if we
people
get
don't
it all,
fully understand it, like me. I don't claim to fully understand how Article 6 is going to work.
Mhm.
I mean, I see the need of nesting interventions, but it's a messy thing, right?
Yeah.
In the backdrop as well,
adjustments.
there's also like legacy issues stemming from this question around accuracy around nature-based solutions, but there's other more politicalized issues that have been plaguing the inclusion of nature-based solutions within Article 6. I think the good news is Article 6 is at operationalization level. There's been some progress at Article 6.2 with bilateral pathways being built, but they're not perfect. It's kind of like you still have to have the MOUs and the implementation agreements, and then you have to have the corresponding adjustment and the architecture. And each time it's kind of built, bilaterally. And then you've got the unilateral approach under 6.4, and that is hopefully starting to, operationalize. Pilot registry is coming to life. And, I think over the next 12 months or so, we'll start to see first sort of large transactions emerge, and some hopefully good volume start to emerge around that 6.4 ITMO side of things. But it's the UNFCCC. It moves slowly. But as it relates to nature-based, I think the voluntary carbon market is always leading in this space and trying to drive the innovation. I mean, you've just been spending the last 30, 40 minutes talking about how technology has been harnessed to ultimately provide better granularity, better confidence, better accuracy with regards to quantifying the biomass that is held within existing forests and the impact of degradation and deforestation, and then how it's also being applied to the regeneration and reforestation initiatives under these various different approaches and methodologies. And that's really important because obviously this is an important lever that we need to address, right? But it's obviously really good that then the technology is actually leading to better innovation and information and decision making that comes with it. So that's what I'd comment on that side.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I have some kind of forward-looking, kind of questions for you, Marco,
Yeah.
as we kind of wrap up the episode here, conscious of time. But like, what do you think is ultimately the bigger story with regards to tying together like AI, MRV, carbon markets? Like, is it better measurement, better markets, or better outcomes for forests, or are those things all kind of synonymous?
Yeah, they're not synonymous. They're not the same thing, but I think they're tied. I think the better measurement is definitely a piece of it in the sense that we can improve the way we measure, but also it's better accessibility, auditability, and harnessing of the measurement, right?
Yeah.
The promise of GeoAI is to make geospatial data usable the same way we basically use non-geospatial data today. If you're working with a co-pilot AI and you're having it doing things for you, then, probably that stops at interacting with maps. And so the promise of GeoAI is to actually go beyond that and be able to interact with maps. And so make the whole kind of bureaucratic boxing kind of complex exercise part of developing project faster so we can actually focus on the human side, on the intervention side, on the stuff that is actually the hardest one and probably more important one. So that's one thing. In terms of better markets, I think it is possible that we improve the accuracy of the measurement, also improves trust in the outcomes. And if we avoid the pitfall of fundamentally kind of constant revision of the approaches, and I think we have to think about this, giving some grace that people did things with the tools that they had and with the knowledge that they had, and like going back and calling people like names for having a project that has a baseline that now that we have data that they didn't have doesn't hold water. At least let's have the proof that was malice, right? As opposed to basically kind of assuming malice and ill intent, because it's going to be possible to, and it's going to be easier to do things that today are very, very difficult to do. And so when we look back at projects that have been done with the old tools, you might come up and say, well, this doesn't hold water anymore. Maybe it's not as additional, doesn't make sense. But also I think we need to be aware that we don't know everything, right? That there's local knowledge that doesn't make it into the satellite map. And also the kind of remote sensing based benchmarks and dynamic baselines and stocking index and so on, I think are an improvement because they do create a layer of trust and also of, let's say, kind of remove some arbitrariness in the decision and actually decide whether something has having an impact or not. And so they're kind of more reliable in some ways, that they could be missing some important dynamic that you're actually not picking up. And we see this now when we help customer with VM47. And in VM47, a very important thing is how you actually set up your donor pool. So where do you actually select your dynamic controls from? And if you miss some important factor, you can end up with a very skewed view of what this alternate reality is. And so we should also avoid being blindly kind of believing in the algorithms and actually also kind of step back and think about, does that actually make sense? Am I missing something? And I'm not seeing something that the person who's actually working in the landscape actually knows and it's not showing up in my maps, but it's actually an important fact. I think there's a level of humility that I think we shouldn't lose as we get these powerful technologies in our hands.
I think that's a really salient point, Marco. I think that level of just awareness. And like you said, it comes down to humility. And in the market, we obviously need as many different sources of data. And it seems like there's a stacking. You went through it earlier, right? You talked about the actual measurements on the ground, and then the allometric equations, height, et cetera, width and diameters, et cetera. And then LIDAR, you talked, and obviously the geospatial component. It seems that having that view from top down can create that level of confidence. And we can't just assume that one is in isolation going to provide the most accurate sort of data set. It's an internal kind of checking with all of the data, right?
Yeah, I think it's enabling the ground layer to operate informed by the spaceborne layer and give it the contextual intelligence to target the data collection in the field to where it has the most impact. So what is the most impactful effort that you do in the field? Is it to go ahead and do stuff as if you didn't have remote sensing information? No. It's to actually take the remote sensing information, get as much insight that you can from the remote sensing information, and then go out and check and validate or support or improve and produce data that can actually substantially improve. And that is often a lot cheaper than doing it the old way. And so it's saving money that instead can go into the interventions. So that's a critical thing that remote sensing can do, which is fundamentally allow the field measurements to be targeted and improve the accuracy or achieve the same accuracy at a lower cost. Those are kind of the two possible things one can do.
Yeah, I think it's really, really well said. And thank you so much for sharing all of these insights. I think it was a really great conversation. Where should people follow Chloris's work? Like, where should if they look at their...
I think obviously there's a website, which is chloris.earth, and you basically get a lot of stuff, and then follow us on LinkedIn. We're not on Insta. We're not on TikTok yet, I think.
Maybe in the future.
Maybe in the future.
We're kind of a bunch of quasi-boomer Gen Xers. Gen Xer cops like the Vampire Weekend song.
All right. Well, look, we really appreciate you taking the time to join us and share your perspectives. We covered a lot of ground. So thanks again for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thanks, Marco. That was really interesting. I learned a lot during that conversation. So thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.